Does washing the dishes, filing reports, changing diapers, does any of that matter to God? Well, this week we're going to talk to Dr. Stephen Garber. He is a renowned essayist. He writes quite beautifully to the average Christian about the nature of vocation. What does it mean to work? Why is work significant to God? What does it mean to be a human who works and has a vocation and a calling apart from their occupation? We talk about everything from the toil of hard work, different ideas of career that Gen Z faces, and all the complicated issues surrounding how what we do matters to God. If you like what we do here at the Center for Hebrew Thought, the Biblical Mind, then please like and subscribe. You can rate us however you want. I'll give up on trying to get 5-star ratings out of y'all. Also, if you want to give to us, you can send those recurring donations to thebiblicalmind.org/give. Any recurring donors over $20 a month get a free copy of our book on prophecy and poetry, the latest edition, which is a collection of essays from authors who have written for the Biblical Mind.
This is the Biblical Mind Podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
As I watch the world, really all over the world, Asia and Africa and Europe and Latin America and North America, I think that the church as church stumbles over the very meaning of vocation pretty badly. And we stumble over it because we are disposed to dualism in the church, wherever the church is. We just can't imagine, how it is and why it is and why would it matter to God? Why should it matter to us? We ought to see the world more coherently. And so for all kinds of theological and historical and ecclesial reasons, I suppose, we can't imagine any other world than one we have to conceive of, construct as a more dualist universe. In the long history of the Catholic Church, vocation is reserved for priests and nuns. So if you have a vocation and you are, intended to be, somebody more religious is the language which is used, of course. The Orthodox have their own ways of stumbling. The Protestant world, of course, the last few centuries. There was early on, in Luther and Calvin in particular, a great recovery of a deeper biblically born understanding of the calling of God upon ordinary people in the world. But because of our disposition to dualism, it didn't take very long before us to, begin to say, "Are you sure, Martin Luther, that a cobbler could be?" And I can't see how quite that would be like that. Could it really be? And if imagined an early life in Geneva, Switzerland, caring about the public sewers, because those things matter to God and His people in the world. It isn't very long before, of course, we just began to stumble over. I do think there are some theological visions and histories which are better on this than others. But I do think that, that wherever I go, I find that, just to be a finger to the wind, when you think about things we pray about as the church gathers, we assume in some ways what we pray about ought to matter most to God and to us. But I think how rare it is for the church ever to pray about people in ordinary life, having ordinary work in the world. Vocation is very rarely brought up or remembered in the worship of God. I would say, just to finish this, that my own long-held credo has been that vocation is integral, not incidental to the mission of God, to the Missio Dei.
Yeah, and by dualism, I assume that you mean this kind of heightening of spirituality, that the greatest things are in the heavenly realms, and kind of the old school caricature of Platonic spiritualism. And everything kind of have to do with the muck and yuck of daily life is just what we have to do to get by. But as my Brazilian church parishioners, when I was in a Brazilian church in Newark, New Jersey for 13 years, when they found out I was a pastor, they're like, why are you doing this professor thing? Like, why you should be a pastor. Like you're ordained as a pastor. You should be working on it. That's the high calling, right? This professor thing is kind of a joke, right?
Yes, that's exact. In 1,000 ways, Drew, that face is, seen all over the world.
It strikes me that one of the most, I come from the biblical scholarship world, but if you're reading the Old Testament, if you're thinking about the festival cycles, if you're thinking about the kind of the life of the agrarian subsistence farmer in the Iron Age and how they celebrate and worship God, it seems, I don't know, maybe I'm naive. It seems impossible that you wouldn't see that working the field is a labor of, it's actually where you meditate on God's Torah. It's where you do this work, right? Is in the field day and night. So I wonder if this is also a Bible, I tie everything to Bible literacy or Bible illiteracy, but I wonder if there's a little bit of Bible literacy problem going on here.
Yeah. hmm No, I'm sure you're right about that. If you are representing the Center for Hebraic Thought, I was just thinking about what that would mean for this conversation, Drew, and thinking, one of the most glorious and instructive of all the Psalms is Psalm number 8, which places human beings in the very middle of God's work in the world, in the middle of the cosmos. We are agents, we are stewards, we are meant to be a little lower than the angels, of course, to do what? To take up God's work in his world.
Mhm.
So I do think that there's a biblical literacy problem. And I would say that, again, you are the Center for Hebraic Thought person, but the church is stumbling over the meaning of sexuality in the Song of Songs. We just can't quite imagine, this could be anything other than a metaphor for the smile of Jesus. You
Right.
think it looks like a bottom to me.
Right.
I think the church just has not been able to figure out how to actually take the goodness of God's creation and understand our place in relationship to it. We just don't do that very well.
I always love to point out that there's a strong rabbinic tradition that says it's obvious what the Song of Songs is about. It's about mathematics. Uh, it's a medieval tradition, so you can imagine why they might say that.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think I wonder two things that I would like to put in conversation with vocation here is one, where does the Protestant work ethic fit in here? And then later, I would like to return to the idea of career and careerism, because I think that's the only vocabulary we have today that we can employ
Mhm.
successfully or unsuccessfully, as the case may be.
Right. Um, well, this is true, but almost every good thing that happens in this world has the possibility of being stewarded well and rightly, and then being stewarded poorly, and we miss the point. We distort or we skew along the way. I often think about my wife Meg, who I've been married to for most of 50 years. Her kisses are a good gift to me, but that kisses could be distorted and misused, and you could hurt somebody for the rest of life by the wrong kiss at the right time by the wrong person. And so it isn't that somehow a kiss itself is, to be held in suspicion. But the
Mm.
question in Augustinian terms is, you know, where does it where does it find its place in the ordering of your loves? Um, and so I would say, on the question of what the Protestant Reformation brought about, uh, you know, when you get a few hundred years away, it's hard always to know, did that person really say this or not? And since you Center for Hebraic Thought, you've walked the streets of Jerusalem and the cities of Israel, and you know that tradition says, it's pretty easily said, whichever turn you make on the little street. Well, the tradition
Right.
said that, and I don't mind that. It's harder to get history other than those kind of uh, uh, reflections because we don't really know. We weren't there. But I would say, so someone like Luther, did he really say, that the when the nurse, the woman milking the teats of the cow, that her hands, her fingers were as holy as the priest who offers the Holy Sacrament. I mean, I think that theologically, I believe that's true. Um, did Luther say that? I'm not sure exactly, but he believed that, something quite
Mm.
pretty close to that. So I would say that there was something that God did in history through these fathers, mostly of the Reformation thought, as we look back on it now, centuries later, um, to say, well, they understood something about the coherence of the cosmos. Uh, and they understood something about the nature of God and nature of human beings in God's world. And so they were, in some ways pushing back on centuries upon centuries of abuse within the church as it had unfolded over time. And we all know some of those stories. And not only was it in terms of, buying your salvation, things which are egregious errors, for the church to have to wrestle with, but, as it worked out sociologically and historically, I'm sure people like Luther were saying, really, it is like that, and the priest is this, like this, and he does this, and the rest of us have no relationship to, and whether Luther actually said, why should the devil have all the good music? I don't know, but he thought things like that, in
Right.
some ways, willing to listen to the taverns and the pubs of his own day and think, well, that's a pretty good tune, and couldn't we sing a song by that one, when we gather together on Sunday this next week? Um, so I would say that, uh, in my mind, uh, it was a wonderful, important reformation of the church's thinking about the nature of what it means to be a human in the world. First of all, what does it mean to be, in relation to the God of heaven and earth? What does it mean to be image bearer of God in the world? What does it mean to live by the laws and the ways of God in the world? What's the meaning of that for ordinary life in the world for ordinary people? And I think that was the heart of Reformation, gift to centuries and to the church and to the world. Um, but, over time, uh, you can begin to take this and move that and misuse this and misunderstand that. And, you know, uh, it's not hard for me looking back in history, as I understand it, at least, to see that in more Protestant, formed societies in Europe, there was something about a political economy that seemed, looking back, something that was more healthy than what had happened under more Catholic-dominated societies in Europe. They couldn't quite figure out, somehow even to break free from the clerical dominance of not only the church but also the world. They couldn't. They didn't bring into being the more industrial, entrepreneurial economies that the more
Mm.
Protestant countries did. So there's something I think that's worth pondering over that. The Protestant work ethic, clearly it was had a pejorative reading in the last, generations, more than constructive. Well, it meant this, and it came from this, and it made this happen, and I think, well, okay, I see all that too, but I do think that, you know, in that magnificent study of American life in the 1980s, Habits of the Heart, by the University of California professors, Robert Bellah and company, looking towards like, what are we going to do to recover a more hopeful future for America? One of the most important paragraphs in the book is we need to have a recovery of a sense of calling and vocation. If we're going to actually begin to understand what work means and what work means for the wider good, for the wider common good. And they rooted it actually in the biblical vision of calling. I
Hmm.
think it's true. I just think it's true because you can't get there apart from a deeper reading of what vocation means for the church and the world.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I mean, it calls me back to Genesis, right? Before anything went wrong in the creation account. You have work and marriage and rest, which rest makes sense because you have work.
Right.
Obviously, toil is injected into the work formula. I teach a lot of freshmen, 18-year-olds. I have young adult children.
Yeah.
And I always show a cartoon, and I won't get it right, but it's, a comic, like a New Yorker cartoon that, a guy loading a dishwasher saying that, is at that moment that Bob realized that not every single moment of his life was going to be filled with meaning and joy or something like that. Uh, but
Yeah.
I think it's very difficult, or I've noticed the story around careerism, passion, uh, calling, vocation that kind of gets sold, as you said, there's various versions of that story. Uh, almost almost equates in some people's minds that, well, if you're not doing what you love, you shouldn't do it anymore, or that kind of like, if you're doing what you love, it's not work, and you're getting paid to do it.
Yeah.
I do. I wonder where the actual grind. Of course, maybe this is my 7 years in the military speaking, but just the grind of having to get things done and not enjoying it. And there's something not only pedagogical that it teaches you, but there's also a certain type of joy that can be had, a pleasure that can be had from digging a ditch that is not fun, and does not end quickly, and you keep looking and you still have more to go. I compare it to grading. I actually have
Yeah, I
a
understand that.
academic ditch digging
Yeah.
right here. So, um, yeah, so I wonder if you could speak about that kind of the toil and the grind, but also the redemptive side of that.
So how much time do we have, Drew?
Take your time.
Um, Well, because I'm deeply born of this grand biblical meta-narrative from creation to consummation, I think about all of life in that light. Uh, and, not only does the scripture teach this story, but of course, the great teacher of the church, Augustine, first formulated this in his own way 400 years after the life of Christ, and offers us, posse peccare, posse non peccare, all the way from beginning to end of the story. We are instructed, if we pay attention to the biblical vision, of what we now have come to call a now but a not yet world. A world where Christ has come to make everything be new. All things have been made new. And yet, even the creation groans. And we do too. So I don't live in any other world than that world. So I'm not a romantic about it, but I also am biblically moored too, to understanding the goodness of God's world, the goodness of my wife's kisses, the goodness of good work. I like to plant, so this is the springtime in Virginia, and I finished the day yesterday with my, hands dirty and, washing them off again, and, my jeans dirty, and, having put my hands in the soil throughout the day, and I do that, and I love that, and I love that, and I love that, even as I groan over the weeds that come up too at the very same time. And So on the one hand, I'm not a romantic about anything, though I am somebody who tries to be tethered quite consciously to this meta narrative from creation to consummation, which understands both the goodness of work, but also the grievousness and the sorrow and the weariness of work in the world too. So just because you are the Center for Hebraic Thought, maybe it would be worth just noting that in the prophet Zechariah, which is a long book, of course, and it's full of woe and lament and complexity and historical and political, grief, and and it goes on and on and on and on. Um, the very last words of the whole prophecy are ones which I have chosen to stop and ponder and actually to think, yes, that's the world I believe to be true. Um, so the very last words of the prophecy are these: someday, even the cooking pots will be called holy to the Lord.
Mm.
And it's intriguing to me because, probably like you, I've traveled different places, and I've sat for suppers in little Kenyan villages, which the cooking pots are made from the clay of the soil around. And I've also, sometimes been drawn into fancy pants, condominiums or houses in the cities of the world. And you think, did you spend $800 on this fire engine red cooking pot? Maybe you did. I don't know. And you realize that every house in the whole world, little rural ones from far, far away, or to big fancy pants ones in the cities of the world, everybody has a cooking pot. It's the most ordinary utensil in the kitchen. Everybody has a cooking pot. And somehow in the wonders and the mysteries and the providences of God, as he told the story of Scripture, the image that it was to be of eschatological hope was that the cooking pot, even the cooking pot, maybe the symbol of drudgery, washing dishes again tonight, even the cooking pot will be called holy to the Lord. So for me, I think we have to hold in tension, both the reality of drudgery and weariness. I get tired. I'm tired at the end of the day. But also somehow, even the middle of the most ordinary things of life, which that there is some symbol of hope, actually, some symbol of eschatological reality. This too has meaning, and someday it too will be called holy to the Lord. So I think about it like that.
Um, how do you deal with or disentangle the confusion for, I think of the American mind? Oh man, this has gotten really bad for younger people as well, is that money and the actual vocation and the money you make for the vocation are somehow entangled. So, um, if you think about a parent that stays home with the children and one that goes off to work, the one that goes off to work has the career. The one who stays home with the children is just the minder, and that largely is because my guess would be is that we show our value of things by paying for them or giving them some economic value,
Right.
and we don't give economic value to what's done in the home, really. And of course, up until excuse me, up until fairly recently, most all the work was done in the home or the homestead, right?
Right.
So this is a new concoction of work. But do you think there's a utility in tethering money and salary to the value of work?
hmm Oh, like, again, everything else we've talked about in this little conversation, Drew, there is a utility. Is it one and the same? It can't be that. Um,
Hmm.
Clearly, there is some meaning to doing that. But you only have to pay attention to a little bit of the world or a lot of history to realize it cannot be done that way, to be honest and true to the world that really is there. Uh, you can look into any window you want, pop culturally or sociologically or historically, realizing that there's not any relationship at all between those whose income has anything to do with the happiness of their lives. It just
Hmm.
doesn't work that way. It does not work out that way. Um, and I mean, why would it be? You are the biblical scholar, but why would it be that in both the Old Testament and then the New Testament, um, if there's any sort of pop cultural poetic reflection on the nature of life in the world, it is, why not then eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die.
Hmm.
Uh, Both the Old Testament prophets remembered that, heard that in their day, as do the New Testament writers. So it's interesting to think about that. I live in Albemarle County now, which is in Charlottesville, Virginia. The poet laureate of Albemarle County is Dave Matthews. Uh,
Huh.
and he owns more land than anybody else in the whole county. Why? Because of his songs like Trippin' Billies, which he says, what? Why not then eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. Um, and I would just say that history seems to be pretty clear about it if you pay attention, if you're listening very carefully. That there isn't any particular, relationship inherently, at least, between, the income you have and the happiness that you have. Uh, I think that, again, I mean, part of the problem here is, as I listen, um, is that the church doesn't do very well with this. We don't teach very well about this. We don't sing songs that reflect this. Our hymns don't reflect this theology. Our prayers typically don't. How often have you been in a church, Drew? I don't know that at all about your life, but I'm just guessing that you're probably like most people I know. How often has it been that, that Susan, who stays at home watching over a 4-year-old and her 7-year-old, we pray for her this morning. If you're praying for the Bible translator in New Guinea and for the
Hmm.
missionary in Kenya, we just don't see ordinary things like that as being worthy to pray about or to sing songs about, or to preach as if somehow this has meaning for your life in the world. So this church is deeply, deeply plagued by the dualism, liturgically, in a way which is, I think, tragic, actually, because it diminishes a sense of meaning to one's life. Because why should I think it matters if God doesn't? And because God doesn't, because of course the church sure doesn't, you know. And I think in some ways it'd be its own sort of 21st century reformation if we could even to say, could we this next week begin to pray
Hmm.
for, so and so who's a mother at home with her children, so and so who's a kindergarten teacher, and so who's an attorney, and so who's a journalist, and so who's a farmer. And we don't have a theology like that in the church at large. We don't preach that way. We don't pray that way. We don't sing that way.
Yeah, now that me and my wife are in our 50s, I think my wife has we maybe this is something you do when you're in your 50s. You kind of look back and say, "Did anything I do matter at all?"
It,
I don't
it
I
gets
don't know if
wild.
that just yeah,
Mhm.
maybe that's my insecurities on display here. But my wife has, when she's talking to younger parents, the common thread has been, it's just hard. I mean, we had 4 kids under 5 years old, 2 adopted, 2 biological, and there's just years where it was just really hard, and there was not, as you said, there was not a lot of acknowledgement of that in the church, and, uh, I didn't abandon her to that task, but, I always think like, "Wow, I could have probably done a lot more work than I did," because I was working in the church, and I saw that as, like, my career. This is what I'm called to do, and I have to be doing this. And I have actually, and you can correct me on this, but I've taken to telling young men and women who are looking at their careers, they say, well, if somebody stays at home, it's too bad because they're losing out on all these opportunities career wise. And I say, well, whoever stays at home, whoever goes off to work needs to also cut back on hours and needs to miss promotions and needs to miss opportunities as well for their sake of their investing in their family at that time, because it seems like such a precious time. And I guess I'm saying all of this to say there is this kind of general trajectory for single and married people that you kind of have this sweet spot where everything falls into place. And then after that, you're lost. So it's almost like a moonshot for them. And that seems to be how they conceptualize it. And I always say, like, look, I didn't even do my PhD until I was 35 with 4 kids, moved over to the UK. That was my third career. Like, but that doesn't really land with them. So I wonder how you think about that wasted time in career seeking or career training.
Mhm. Well, again, you and I are talking in the year 2026, Drew, and if we were talking in the year 1826, it'd be a different conversation, wouldn't it? Because we wouldn't be talking about career like that, most of us at all. Couldn't have imagined even a world like that, where we were talking like I'm making choices about what I'm doing with my life. Some did, but most couldn't even have imagined what you're saying to me. And it isn't that it was all fated or all karma. That wasn't what I'm saying, but in some ways, the sociological, historical, context of life in the 1800s wasn't like that. So we are in some ways. I don't think this is a bad word, but it sometimes can be seen pejoratively. I think we are graced or we're privileged to be even having this conversation. But like most everything else in life, what could be gifts to us and blessings to us could be curses to us too. So choice and over choice and too much choice, clearly for many people, especially younger people, I think can be a plague upon them. Um, and I have good friends who think about these questions all the time, and I do in my own way. I spend most every day of my life, Drew, talking to somebody somewhere about what should I do with my life. Uh, and either it's me speaking about that or writing about that or speaking somewhere somebody wants to talk about it. It's a pretty dominant question for most people. What should I do with my life? And it is not an unhealthy question. It isn't a bad question. Um, but maybe just to say one more thing about it, I think if there's you know a confusion I hear almost always, it's between the ideas vocation and that of occupation.
Mm.
I think that vocation is the deeper, truer, longer word. Occupation isn't that word. It's related, but it isn't the same word, um, because vocation is what makes Dru Johnson different than his dad, bit different than his best friend, different than his wife. It's what makes you be you in the history of the whole world, uniquely you in all of history, really. Personality, gifts, size, interests, thoughtfulness, personality. I mean, everything about you that is written into, what we should honestly call the vocation of Dru Johnson. Um, uh, Occupation isn't that word. It's related to it, but I would say that it has to do something more like, as you said, before I was 35, I had done this and I'd done this and I was going to do this now. And, you weren't changing. You weren't changing. But you were entering into different contexts for you to be deepened and developed and expressed. So for me, occupation has more to do with in what responsibilities and relationships am I now occupying as I spend the next years of my life at this. Uh, and the hope, of course, the deep longing that for every one of us, sons of Adam, daughters of Eve, that we are, the deep longing is there should be, a graceful coherence between my vocation and my occupation. But again, in the now but not yet of history of your life and mine, none of us have complete coherence. None of us do. And it's only a fiction to think that she does, or clearly he does. He has it all together. But of course, as you know, because you've been pastor along the way, you just scratch a little bit on the forearm of the heart of people, and they too struggle. They too have longings. They too feel dissonance between what they have to do day by day and what, in a sense, they really wish they could do day by day.
In the Brazilian church we were in, it was mostly people who had immigrated to the New York City area, some legally, some not. And they had taken multiple jobs, painting the subways or driving taxis or cleaning houses. It was interesting to me how they all had a very similar vocational pattern, which was I was responsible to do good work, and I was responsible to share the good news with
Uh,
the people I worked with. And that was a constant thread in no matter what people did kind of in the grind side of work where there weren't a lot of choices and they weren't weighing career options. They were actually doing all this so that their children could weigh career options and their children went to good universities. Um, so I think I can hear what you're saying scales to all kinds of different jobs with different degrees of freedom and different degrees of
Right.
toil to them as well. Yeah. Um, can I back up a little bit to how you were formed and shaped? And if I have heard correctly about you, you went to Labrie at some point.
Yeah.
Um, and I wonder, how do you tell people, how do you explain Labrie to people? And then how do you think it shaped you?
We moved to Charlottesville last summer, where we have 2 kids and 8 grandkids. We bought a house across the street from our oldest, a daughter, and, when she was 20, she was studying in Geneva, Switzerland for a semester, international health and development, and, on her own initiative, without asking for permission, because why did she need to at age 20? She decided that she would go up into the mountains of Switzerland to visit this little village called Wemo and this place called Labrie, where I had gone when I was a 20-year-old college dropout. And after she got back, she, said how much she loved it and was surprised by how hospitable it was, and thought maybe she would like to drop out of school when she finished that semester and go back and spend, another year there. She ended up spending about 10 years there, actually, kind of moving
Hmm.
through the position of a student, then a helper, then a worker. And I would say that she would still see that Labrie world as being her second home. In fact, last summer, she's 45 years old now, 46 years old now, and she has 3 kids, a husband, and last summer they spent about 2 months living in Wemo as a
Hmm.
family. So it's been a very deeply formative part of her life, and it was for me too, Drew. I had no, family who'd ever been there. I hadn't had any friends who'd ever been there. I had heard about it, and the word on the street was if you had an honest question, you could get an honest answer at this place called Labrie. And there was no internet, there were no brochures. It was simply the word on the street, literally. And
Hmm.
uh, and I had some questions. I had dropped out of college earlier, a year before that, and was living in the Bay Area in a commune, and working on a sort of a countercultural magazine, and hitchhiked in across America the next year, and ended up, at Labrie. And um, I've always said this about it, Drew, that I met people and ideas there that shaped me for the rest of my life. Um, and I've always been grateful for its influence in my life in that way. We have 5 kids. I think 4 of them have spent some time at Labrie in their own, 20-something, moments along the way. The one, of course, having more of a deeper formative experience, the one who's our neighbor now. But I think that, it is. I was asked a few years ago, with kind of a wonderful surprise moment in my life, by the publisher for Schaeffer, the IVP, was doing a 50th anniversary edition of some of their major books along the way, and they
Hmm.
wanted to do it for Schaeffer's The God Who Was There. And
Hmm.
they could have asked, tens and tens of people to do this. I got asked to write the foreword for it, to introduce it to a new generation. And I mostly, chose to write about the apologetic of hospitality,
Hmm.
that marked Labrie, more than Schaeffer argued for this, and he took up this, and he argued against this, and he made this argument about that. I mean, all those things were interesting in their own different way, but I was arguing, in fact, it was the embodied apologetic, of come and live among us, and come and think with us, and come wash dishes with us, and come work in the gardens with us, and come think with us, come read what you want to read, what you need to read, to answer your own honest question as you wrestled for your own honest answer here in this context of a community which lived to be an exhibit of, the reality that God is there in the world. So, um, and I think that was a great gift to me. It's still a good gift for people, and I'm a I'm a believer in the good work of Labrie. So,
Uh, I I often tell parents whose kids are looking at college, I say, "Hey, college is great. Maybe take a year or 2 off and go work a job. Not, don't go backpack Europe, but go work a job.
mhm.
Learn the value of a dollar and of the Protestant work ethic." Because I have found those students, when they come back into the university system, are some of my best students. I mean, sometimes you get naturally gifted people who are natural work ethic. Um, And I wonder if Labrie in some ways serves a little bit of that. You said you were a college dropout. I assume you went back to college at some point and got higher education, got higher training. Um, but the problem is our system is set up for 18-year-olds who, even more so now. I mean, I think about the 1980s. 18-year-olds were probably vastly more mature, at
Mhm.
least in sense of the kinds of responsibilities they had, their sense of the world, than they are today. Just physiologically, I feel like even I'm dealing with uh, adolescents who are in their late 20s now, but they still have kind of adolescent approaches to the world, right?
Mm,
Um, and so I think often, is that the right advice? And the only thing going against it is, well, they need what they would say is a vocation. They need a job. They need a career. They need an occupation that will pay their bills, which I agree. They do. People do need to contribute. Um, but that seems to be the only thing that an American mind, even an American evangelical mind, can comprehend, is that at the end of the day, this kid needs to get a job, a high-paying job that will give them maximum amount of leisure time,
mm,
uh, that hopefully they'll spend with me, their parent, and and that's it. And so the idea of asking them to step back from college in their mind seems to be to just interrupt every single idea they've ever had about themselves in their own personal progress.
mm, mm.
So how do you coach people in those moments? And I would assume you at least lean towards my position. I don't know. Maybe you disagree. I'd like to hear.
Oh, I agree deeply with you. It's hard to say, unless the family rule is you cannot go to college until, and some families probably are that way.
Right.
Uh, I would say, our five kids, we had several that either before college or early on stepped away. Yeah, so this is kind of a throwaway remark, but it's true mostly. I think that college is too valuable to waste on an 18-year-old. The possibilities of learning as an undergraduate, there's too much possibility and goodness to waste on an 18-year-old who just doesn't know enough yet to know what he or she really needs to know. Um, um, and I don't think it's a moral issue in a particular way. I just think that it's a maturing, reality that's, you just don't know enough about yourself and the world around you to know what you ought to be doing when you're, a freshman in college. And I would say about Labrie and my own experience. I mean, I wasn't that I was flunking college. I had a sense that there were better reasons, more important reasons than passing the next test that ought to
Mhm.
be part of my experience as an 18, 19, 20-year-old. And I couldn't see what should be motivating me than simply to get the next paper done, to pass the next test, to get the next grade. And I wanted more, Drew. I just wanted more. That's why I dropped out, really. And and I'd say when I was at Labrie, I think the great, great gift of it to me was that I learned to learn.
Hmm.
In some ways, maybe it was that I was a few years older than, 17, 18-year-old, but I learned to learn. And I think I began to see principally that the learning was going to be primarily on me.
Hmm.
And even though, I was an eager student, I was an eager listener to wise people who were older than me. I'm still that way in a surprising way. But I would say I was that kind of 18, 19, 20-year-old who sought teachers out because I wanted to learn from them. But I even could see then that that I needed more, and I realized that when was away, that that to learn what mattered was going to be principally on me, Steve Garber.
Hmm.
And it wasn't that um, I was the sole, agent in the learning process, but that it had to be more to had to do with the questions that mattered to me, and that if I had a sense, even in a small kind of 19, 20, 21-year-old way, but a deepening vocation in my own life. These things are me. These things matter to me. Then if I had a sense that those were the things that were giving coherence to my studies, I could find a way of asking questions in literally every class that
Hmm.
would allow me to deepen insight into what I wanted to learn. Um, and I think that was a great, great gift to me of the Labrie, pedagogy.
Yeah. I had a similar experience, but mine was from coming out of the military. I had questions and I needed answers, and I was patient enough to say, like, okay, I need to understand a little bit about history. I need to understand about psychology. And I was not a great, it's not a wonderful student, but I was highly motivated. Even
Yeah.
today, I tell my students, I'm here to facilitate learning, hopefully to prod you to learn, but the work is on you, and they do not like that at all. They they come, and especially if I'm sure you've taught in other continents and countries, there can often be this, you're the expert,
Mhm.
you contain all the fire hydrant material. We're here to just, catch whatever flies
Right.
past us.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and that's very depressing to some people when they realize, like, no, this is going to require a lot more than just
Mm.
taking notes.
And you can see that, I mean, again, it's more the question of telos, I suppose, because it's more if you see undergraduate learning as a way to learn for the rest of your life, or that this is the end point, and when I'm done being a student, I'm done being a student, and I go on into my life, and so I think that, if you have more the former idea about what undergraduate years could mean and should mean, then
Mhm.
you realize that you're learning to learn about the world, and you're learning to read, you're learning to think, you're learning to analyze, you're learning to make sense of, and that's not the same thing as, that I am I am a receptacle to take in and write notes about and give back to you all that you've said to me, and that's what learning is about. Um, and in some ways, Drew, I think, again, I'm just sort of playing on the Hebraic, thought part of who you are, but, you know, it's as perennial, a response as anyone we have in the history of the human race, because it's its own version of, it's that woman you gave me. Um, you know, it's that professor you gave me. It's that,
Right.
it's that, she's the one, he's the one who's responsible for what I learn here. And if I don't learn what my parents want me to learn, what the job market expects me to learn, well, it's my professor, of course. And I think for me, the maturing, of dispositions and, heart and mind in my away from school years was to realize, well, you want good teachers, don't you? You need to have a good teacher, but what you learn and how important the learning is more for you, Steve.
Mm. I'm curious about when you went to Labrie, and I won't pester you about Labrie,
No,
but I'm
it's
just
okay. It's
interested in
fine.
those old
It's
days of Labrie. What were your questions? What were the big nuts you wanted to
Well,
crack?
it's interesting to ask that because I still think about that as being, in some ways, surprisingly central to who I am, Drew, years later.
Hmm.
Um, uh, um, I lived as I said, in a commune in the Bay Area the first year, and it was, kind of between the worlds of Berkeley and Stanford, Palo Alto and Berkeley, and I would literally I was living in Palo Alto, but I was kind of hitchhiking between the two communities week after week, just listening into the gurus of all kinds of ideas for week after week, and I began to see, somehow, and they, wasn't said it out loud so much, but I just began to pick up in that course of that year that every debate I listened into, every idea I heard being argued, on some level, in some way, came back to, what does this person believe about human beings?
Hmm.
To put it in the language of, Psalm 8, what is man? You know,
Hmm.
uh, what does it mean to be human? In Jerem Bars's, question from years ago. Um, and, whether it was politics, whether it was economics, the arts, sexuality, everything was hearing in the debates of the universities and the university subcultures that those cities represented, everything somehow came back to an argument about, what does it mean to be human?
Hmm.
And that has these implications, and economically or politically or sexually or artistically or whatever, you know. And I realized, because I had, been raised by people who loved God and wanted me to love God, I had some rudimentary theological framework to think with, but I realized that Christians taught that we made the image of God. But I remember literally thinking, that's a very short sentence, isn't it?
Hmm.
Um, not sure what I should say after I said those words. So when I went to Labrie, the question I thought I had in my own heart was, I want to understand, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? What does it mean to be human? Um, and I would say, in some ways, Drew, in a surprising, window into my own sense of vocation over years now, still what I'm working on. It is still what I'm working on. My undergraduate thesis, my master's, my PhD, all were one more, in C.S. Lewis's, best image of further up and further in, to that question. That's just been what I've been thinking about ever since then. I've taken that question all over the world, literally. And, I think about, um, our conversations this past week in Portland and Indianapolis. I'm going to Denver tomorrow. Um, and I know that somehow, in some way, I will again say out loud, well, you see, my great teacher Walker Percy put it like this, the great novelist, essayist, that bad books lie. They lie most of all about the human condition.
Hmm.
And you can see that's
Okay.
one more window into that question. And I've taken that insight of Percy's everywhere for years and years now, whether it's to the Beijing Film Academy in China, making the argument, bad films lie, don't they?
Right.
They lie most all about the human condition. So anyway, that Labrie question has become the question of my life.
The idea that books lie, films lie, stories lie. Again, I'm just throwing all my rants past you.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Completely for me. But I'm an anti-romantic in the sense that I've seen a lot of the destructive power of people holding other people hostage to their unrealistic ideas of the world. And so I take it when you say lie, I take you to mean something like they are polishing a turd in some way, as we like to say, or they're selling you a story that is completely inhuman and inhumane. What do you mean by the lie? How do you unpack that?
I taught politics for a long time, Drew, at Capitol Hill. So in some ways, my sensibilities about many things were forged in those years of wrestling with undergraduates about the nature of our political life as people. And it's as true of political visions as it is of novels or films. Bad political visions lie. They lie most about the human condition. Bad economic paradigms lie most about the human condition. When I was a 20-year-old and thinking the universe through, I read and listening to the countercultural debates of the Bay Area, in the early 1970s. I mean, I was attentive to the debates about the nature of society and how it all got worked out in history. And I know for a time I was intrigued by, the argument from the countercultural left. And I was drawn in by the Marxist critique, because it seemed deep, systemic, powerful, far-reaching, which was important to me in my 20-year-old life. I wanted something that was more than just me. I wanted it to be for a wider world. And I know that one of the gifts of Labrie to me actually was listening to Dr. Hans Ruckmacher, lecture about Reformation versus Revolution. Still remember the impact of his insight about that. Basically, because I was sort of drawn to. I was a dropout after all. I was living in communes after all. And I was open to different ways to think and to live and to be in the world. And but his argument was that that revolution doesn't get you there. And he kind of went into this historical analysis of its movements and its arguments and its positions and its promises. And I began to think, that is true, isn't it? I mean, what I have wanted, a reforming of life, a renewal of society, which was the driver for me, that didn't happen, and it wasn't going to happen in the revolutionary, motif of the world. So I think that I know that I began to, realize that I wanted something deeper and truer. Um, and uh, um, yeah.
It's also very hard to get people to revolt against the system on the basis of a picture of a modestly better government than we currently have. You almost have to construct a lie, and that's not just the Marxist side. It's
No, I think that is. I mean, again, I don't know you at all, Drew. But you don't have to record this if you don't want to. But and I don't know. I was looking on Snopes this morning to see, did this really happen? Was this really said? But I saw some poll from the Fox News, viewers saying that most of them believed that the assassination attempt was staged. You
Oh,
know,
yeah, yeah. That's
and
common
I don't know
now.
if that
Yeah.
really happened or not. I mean, I know there are a lot of ideas being thrown out the last couple of days about what happened, but I mean, when in my reading of listening to what's going on politically right now, when when we have to listen to lies every day, well, what would you think? I mean, how could it be otherwise? And um, so I just think, it's it doesn't work, and in some ways it's another version of the emperor has no clothes. It's somebody sometime has to be willing to say out loud, a Speaker of the House, leading member of the Senate, the emperor has no clothes.
Hmm.
It's a lie. He's insisting we all believe the lie, and it's a lie. Um, because it does, we don't flourish that way, we cannot and we will not and we never will.
Um, yeah, and at some point in history, somebody is going to say this probably pretty soon. So why not just say it now?
Um,
Okay,
I want to say one thing to you. We have some before you
yeah,
say you're done. I want to make sure we've talked about one thing. So just to tell you that.
yeah, go ahead. I was going to ask you one last question about your books.
I
So,
just we'll just because we don't know each other very well, but seeing your in your titled position, Center for Hebraic Thought, you probably don't know, Drew, and why would you? That for years and years I have identified myself as somebody who thinks and lives out of the Hebrew and Christian world and worldview.
hmm.
So that's consciously who I am, and you don't know that because we don't really know each other. But I have pretty seriously, and consciously identified myself that way for a long time.
Hmm. I was probably injected with a similar virus from two guys, Jerem Bars and Jack Collins at Covenant Seminary. So that's good to hear that. I mean, when I listen to you, when I read you, I see somebody who gets what we're doing and like at the core of your being. That's why I was so excited to talk to you. Speaking of your books, somebody who's written many books, I always like to ask them, what order would you suggest reading, and then how nerdy is each book?
Yeah.
so, so if somebody
Well,
wants a light read or just to dip in, what should they read versus a deep dive?
yeah. Well, none that I've ever written are anywhere close to being nerdy, Drew. How could they possibly be? Um, mm, um, I mean, I would say if what I said to you a few minutes ago about the question about the human condition has been one that's threaded its way through my whole life, um, I would say that the writing I've done has had a thread that I'm aware of, at least. I think people who know me pretty well would say, yes, I see that about you. Um, but I got interested a long time ago in this question of sustaining vocation. How do you keep a vocation alive over the course of a life? Uh, it's one thing to be passionate about something or believe deeply about something when you're 21, 22. It's harder when you get to be 28 and harder when you get to be 35. But I began to see that even though in some ways in the parable of the soils, imagery, that most don't continue on.
Mhm.
Most don't understand in the language of the gospel, which the first person understands, but most don't. But some do. I mean, some do keep on keeping on, and it intrigued me to think, why is it that some do, even though most don't? So the first book I wrote was about that. We're looking under the conditions of what we could call modern, postmodern consciousness, why this business of putting together a connected life, a coherent life, why it was important, but also why it was so hard to do that. So that
Mhm.
was really the first book that I wrote. Um, I think I know that 10 years later when I wrote another one, it was really in many ways a response to listening to people all over America and the world who had taken the first book seriously, and they were in their 40s and they hadn't given up. They hadn't walked away, and
Hmm.
that intrigued me. But more than that, even, Drew, they were people who had decided to keep going, and they still believed in what they had committed themselves to, years and years earlier. Weren't just cynical about it, weren't just worn down by it, but they still believed it to be true. And it intrigued me that they did, because every person I talked to in a more serious way had, by the time they got to be 45, they had suffered in some way. They had been disappointed in some way. They had grieved over something in some way. And it intrigued me to think that here you have grieved, here you've been disappointed, and you still believe this to be true? Why would that be? Why and how is that true of you? So the next book, even though it's titled Visions of Vocation, well, maybe not even though it is titled that, Common Grace for the Common Good, the question of the book is it possible to know the world and still love the world?
Hmm.
And so there's a whole chapter there, Dru, director of the Center for Hebraic Thought, about Hebraic thought and about its understanding of what it means to know, this idea of yada, which is so powerful in the Hebrew language. So it's really a whole chapter looking at the meaning of Hebrew thought for this question of vocation, but rooted in epistemology. So you're a friend and mine, Esther Beek, we have together, thought a little bit, but not often together, about, she calls it covenant epistemology. I've called it covenantal epistemology. But it clearly grows out of it a belief that there's something about the epistemological vision born of Hebraic thought, namely in particular the idea of covenant, a covenantal reality that actually gives shape and substance to how we understand what it means to know. And for me, the idea to know and to love the world is the dynamic reality at the heart of what vocation means. Um, the other, if there's someone wants just an easier way in, the fourth book is a book of essays with photos, and about 40 essays. This it's called The Seamless Life, a tapestry of love and learning, worship and work. And you can see something again of the more, Hebraic all of life vision that's even in the titling of the book. Um, but it's essays, shorter essays, and photos with the essays. Again, looking at how do you understand the whole of your life, all of your life, in light of what you believe to be true about the world. This most recent book, um, uh, I don't, how could I think it's nerdy, Drew? I couldn't think it's nerdy. I would say, in fact, in my own self-perception of it, I really wrote it for the whole world, because I've seen that what I've written before has been picked up in the whole world in different ways, published in Indonesia and Slovakia and other parts of the world, China, and I very intentionally wrote it for people all over the world. So I not only every chapter drew in on, stories of people in Africa or in Latin America or Europe, films that are, from Europe, or films from China, or novels from, Africa or whatever. But I also, when I was putting together the book finally with the publisher and getting the endorsements, I purposely worked hard to make sure that people who I knew all over the world, from Singapore and from Rio de Janeiro and, and from London and Oslo and, Timbuktu, were included in those endorsing the book, because I wanted it to be seen as a book that if you were from his part of the world, this too was a book for you. So I write that way. I want to think that way. So, yeah.
Excellent. Well, Steve Garber, thank you so much for your wisdom and your writing over the years. And I hope people look forward to diving into more.
Yeah, well, thank you, Joe. It's such a gift to meet you finally.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.